God is working with you when you choose to do good work. While there are some situations in life that can be categorized as gray areas, for the most part, we can determine when a situation becomes good or bad rather quickly. Often it starts when we're young and we see someone get something good that we didn't get.
I was a little jealous.
That's when we begin to think we've been treated unfairly. Like when a sibling gets a toy or candy that the other sibling didn't get, or when a friend gets to turn in their homework late and the teacher doesn't say anything, but then another friend gets points off for being late.
So that's not fair.
But sometimes unfair situations can be way more serious and even have worse consequences. We've been talking about injustice the past couple of weeks, which we've defined as the things in our world that are unfair, unequal, or not right. It's painful to experience injustice, and it can make us all ask, why doesn't somebody do something? What will it take to make this situation shift from bad to good? Last week, we talked about how God sees and cares about what's happening around us. God is implicitly against injustice. Part of following Jesus means we care about the things He cares about, and that we care enough to actually help shift a situation from bad to good. Maybe you hear that and think, that's great, but what am I supposed to do about it?
What am I supposed to do with this?
And when you look at the world and see how many things aren't fair or cause people harm, it can be overwhelming. We see people who've been victims of injustice, or maybe you've had to deal with injustice in your own life. If you've ever witnessed or experienced injustice, you may show up each week and wonder, how do I handle this when it's happening to me and not just around me? Or maybe others of you are thinking, well, that's not me. That's not my story. And why should I care? But just like with your friends, as a community, when one of us suffers, we all suffer. So if you are experiencing injustice or have experienced injustice, what do you do? What do you do when you feel like you are alone in that situation? What do you do when you realize someone in your community is experiencing injustice? With that in mind, I want to tell you a story. Around 600 BC, there was a Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar who had conquered and captured the people of Israel. One day, he built a giant golden statue and ordered everyone to bow down and worship it whenever they heard a certain song playing. If anyone disobeyed the king's orders, they would be thrown into a blazing fire. One of the authors of the Old Testament, Daniel, wrote that there were 3 worshipers of God who refused to bow down to the statue, and this story is all about them. Now, you could probably guess that the king wasn't thrilled by this news, and he ordered the men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to be brought to him. He gave them one more chance to bow down and worship the statue when the music played, but these 3 men stood their ground. They knew it wasn't right for someone to force them to worship anything other than God, and they believed that God could rescue them. But even if God didn't, they still didn't want to turn their devotion from Him. So of course, the king was full on rage mode and ordered the fire to be turned up. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were tied up and thrown into the fire. The furnace was actually so hot that the soldiers who threw them in died just by going near the flames. Now look, I think we can agree that this situation is intense and unfair. And if you've experienced any kind of injustice, you know it can be scary or frustrating and sad. I think it's safe to say that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could have felt all of those things too. But let's continue on in the story. I want you to hear what happened next when these men were thrown into the fire. In Daniel 3, it says, "Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, 'Weren't there 3 men that were tied up and thrown into the fire?' They replied, 'Certainly, your majesty.' And he said, 'Look, I see 4 men walking around the fire, unbound, unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods.' Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, 'Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out here, come here.' So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor a hair on their head singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them." Now, there are a ton of Bible scholars and researchers who have opinions about this story and who the fourth man in the fire was. Was he God? Was he Jesus? Was it an angel or someone else? I don't know the answer, but one thing is clear. In a moment of extreme injustice, these three stood up for what was right and what was good. And in doing what was good, God made sure that they weren't alone. They were doing good work, and God did not abandon them or leave them to suffer on their own. And in the same way, when you choose to do good work in spite of injustice, God will work with you and not abandon you. Just let that sink in. God is working with you when you choose to do good work. God cared about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's choice to do what was good, standing their ground and standing up for what was right. And in the middle of all that, God made sure they weren't alone in their suffering or injustice. Did things change eventually? Yeah. Did the law change as a result of the injustice? Yes. But don't miss what's happening while they were suffering. God cared for them. And in the same way, God cares about you and doesn't want you to be alone when you face injustice. Now, maybe you hear this story and you really feel the injustice part. I want you to know that you don't have to be alone. God is with you and He hears you. Some of you may have heard the story we just read and thought, well, I haven't really experienced injustice. Sometimes we participate in unjust situations by allowing them to happen while we watch. Now, maybe you don't throw people into a fire, but maybe you laugh at things at the expense of other people or base opinions of others on things that aren't necessarily true. Now, if that's you, you can talk to God about that too. In Psalm 139, the writer is humble and vulnerable and asks God the most open question. See if there is any offensive way in me. Start there. Ask God to help bring things to the surface that aren't necessarily right and allow Him to begin changing your heart. This is so important because the truth is, some people you care about most, your friends from school or your small group, have been on the receiving end of injustice. And maybe for the first time, you see it differently and you care differently because of how it affects them. Let it become personal to you. It's painful when injustice happens, but you don't have to do the work alone. God is working with you when you choose to do good work. Not only is God with you, but so are the people in your small group. That's why we have small groups. We want you to have a group of people who are for you, who listen to you, who pray with you, learn from you, and cheer for you. In your groups, the conversation you have today has the potential to be one of the most honest, personal, and important discussions you've ever had. If you've experienced injustice, think about how you can tell your group that you just need support and a friend. And if you haven't experienced injustice, think about how you can do the good work of either sharing your experience or listening and genuinely caring for someone in your group. Now, this may sound like a lot right now, I get it. Now, even if you don't talk to your whole group tonight, I hope you talk to your small group leader. They signed up to do this because they want to be there for you. Maybe today they can be a real human reminder that when it comes to injustice, God is working with you as you do good work.